This morning, I want to think about David. We've been reading and rereading about David, and as we go through our reading schedule. And what I would like to concentrate on today is, first of all, the fact that David had a passion for planning. David liked his ducks in a row. You know, and initially I just tried to think of occasions where David planned. And even as I jotted them down, I kept thinking of more that I was forgetting than what but you think about it, why 5 rocks? He was planning, wasn't he? I mean, there's a plan there. But consider some others. The unique strategies that he developed in eluding vengeful Saul. Quite a plan, quite a plan. The way that he organized forces in his actions to help Saul face the truth, you know, waving the corner of his robe, saying, you know, I could have killed you if I wanted to kill you, but look, I didn't. And I mean, he forced Saul. His plan was to force Saul to look at the truth. Another occasion that struck me is he's going in to conquer the Amalekites. He has 600 troops. 200 of them, it says, are exhausted, so he leaves them behind. And you remember he goes on and defeats and comes back, and there's some complaint about sharing the spoils and whatnot. But it's pretty wise planning not to take exhausted troops into battle, because more than likely what's going to happen to your exhausted troops? They'll be on the battlefield dead. So a plan. Again, continuing, the conquest of the Moabites. The measuring rod used to decide who was going to live and who was going to die. Now that seems absurd, but it's a plan. It's a plan, isn't it? Even down to Bathsheba and Uriah and all the events that surround that terrible event in David's life. Look at all the planning that went into that process. Even receiving the consensus from Israel about moving the ark. It's a plan. It's a plan. Repeatedly organized his actions, military and otherwise, before the throne of God. He consults God. What should I do? Should I do this? And again, his plan is laid before God. In our more recent reading, we've read about Levites and some of the planning David did. 2,400 temple workers, 6,000 officials and judges, 4,000 gatekeepers, 4,000 musicians. Very intricate planning. How about the military and the leadership? Going to be the heads of the families. There's also going to be the commanders of the thousands. There's going to be the commanders of hundreds. There's going to be the divisions, 24,000, serving on a monthly basis. A marvelous, concise, exact plan. His overseers, his helpers, the royal storehouses, the country storehouses, the farm workers, etc. David just always seems to be passionate about developing some plan. And then, obviously, all the plans that David put into the temple, which he was not going to be able to build. But he still planned. And so we read about the plan for the temple, the storehouses, the upper rooms, the inner rooms, all of the materials, the gold, the silver, all of that stuff, where they were going to get it, where it was going to be, the divisions of the priests, the weight, the gold furnishings, the chair, all of that was planned. David was passionate about planning. Well, not only was David passionate about planning, but David's plans had a purpose. They were driven by purpose. And this is where, to me, this really got interesting. David is obviously a concise man who wants a plan, but he also has a purpose behind every plan. There's a great text that we're going to look at that identifies, I think, the overarching purpose for the plans David made. The majority of the plans, obviously sinful plans, doesn't fit. 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 1. David summons all the officials of Israel to assemble at Jerusalem, the officers of all the tribes, the commanders of the divisions in service of the king, the commanders of the thousands, the commanders of the hundreds, and the officials in charge of all the property and livestock belonging to the king and his sons, together with the palace officials, and mighty men and the brave warriors. David has a huge assembly, calls them all together. First of all, again, we're reminded of how David has so planned that he can just call these folks together. He has his tentacles all reaching into all of these different things. And so he calls these people together, and there's very few people that are exempt from this gathering. And after David goes through some introductory remarks about how God has blessed his family and brought him to where he's at and honored him, and then he comes to the purpose for the plan in verse 8. So now I charge you in the sight of all Israel and in the assembly of the Lord and in the hearing of God. All these people together. He's planned all of this different organization. He has everybody together, and now he says, here it is. Be careful to follow all the commands of the Lord, your God, that you may possess this good land and pass it on as an inheritance to your descendants forever. David's purpose for his plan is illustrated by the fact, first of all, that he initiates to those people a charge. A charge. He says, I charge you. The word indicates a call to responsibility. It is often associated with those who oversee or look after other people. All Israel is gathered together, and what David does is he issues a charge. He issues a call to responsibility. And again, it's interesting that he has all of this plan is in place. And the purpose of the plan is so that he can give people a specific charge to fulfill their responsibility. And that's where he begins the purpose with this charge. David's planning creates an atmosphere of accountability because his charge is made in the sight of all Israel. Everybody knows that I'm placing this charge on you. The person standing next to you who I've planned to be involved in X, Y, or Z, he knows that I've made the same charge to you. Everybody is aware that this charge is in place. David's plan was to have everyone aware and participating with equal responsibility. Everybody was a part. Thirdly, David's plan put everyone on an equal standing, because what he did was he challenged them and he said, not only are we before all Israel, but this is the assembly of the Lord, and we're in the hearing of God. No one was exempt from their part of being in God's assembly and within his hearing ability. I want you to notice how that this planning passion of David's was so that he could issue a challenge to every person that they stood before God. Their responsibility was before God. God was hearing all that was going on. It was his gathering, his assembly. Now, all of that appears to me to be preliminary strategies and the groundwork for the overarching purpose of David's passion to plan. And I think verse 8 ends with the overarching purpose. And that is, be careful to follow all the commands of the Lord your God. Be careful is where David begins that instruction. It's a Hebrew word that meant to guard, to protect, to attend to. It grew from a root Hebrew word which meant to hedge about. So David says, I want you to bring things in. I want you to hedge about yourself. I want you to be careful about the responsibility that you hold before God. I want that to hedge you in. I want the submission to God's commands to be the boundaries that you establish for yourself. And that was the purpose that David set the passionate plan, was so that people could do that, so they could establish that. He says, I want you to be careful to follow. To follow. Again, the Hebrew expression means to tread or to frequent, to follow, to pursue, to search. The implication within the word is that it's very personal. It is a personal seeking, a personal asking. I love how Chris is reminding us of how important it is for us personally to be in the Word and to be seeking and to be following what we're reading and what we're understanding. Because that's, again, the plan is to read, the purpose is to follow. So David says, I want you to be careful. I want you to follow. And then he says, I want you to follow all the commands of the Lord. All the commands of the Lord. The Hebrew word for command means that which is a regulation, a law, a precept, or an ordinance, are other words that would express the original meaning of that word. What I found very interesting, though, and spent far too much time thinking about, so it was a rabbit that I chased for quite a while this week. The word from which the Hebrew word for command comes from is a word that means constitute. Constitute does indicate and does possess the idea of command or precept, but there's a totally additional concept in the original Hebrew that word holds, and that is being the parts of or equal to. Now, I got so enthralled with this, I tried to explain this to Becky, and she goes, that's pretty deep. So hang on. It's not that deep. What does God do when he gives commands? Think about this. We tend to only think a command is a prohibition or an expectation that God puts upon us. If commands are God's way of constituting himself, then a command becomes the way that God makes it possible for people to become equal with him. Right? Like when we reconstitute the frozen orange juice. You add water, and all of a sudden you have what the original was. When God gives a command, our sin has separated us from him. But when God gives a command, that's like throwing the water in here, and all of a sudden God is saying, you can mix this back together and have the original. You can have the same contact with me Adam and Eve did before the fall. Because I'm revealing to you by command the way that you and I can be equal. It is fun to think about, isn't it? You see why I got lost. Add that factor to how you and I process the commands of God. They become the way in which God is sharing himself, his nature, his holiness, his justice. So when God says, I want this of you, God's saying the reason I want this of you is because that's me. And if you live that, you and I reconnect, we reestablish, we have relationship. It's the way of reconstituting a connectivity and a relationship with humanity. Okay, I told you I chased rabbits, so I have to do at least this one little sidebar. Who can keep all the commands of the Lord? Back to Chronicles. David stands before all of Israel and tells them the purpose, I've got all this plan put together, and the purpose of the plan is for you to do what? Obey some of the commands that God's given. For you to obey all of the commands that God has given. The very mouth that's speaking that is unable to do that. But he issues those words. And so then I got to thinking, why is David saying that? This may give some additional input into why he's a man after God's own heart. It's only in keeping all of those commands that one owns all of who God is. If God's commands are given to reconstitute us with Him, the only way we can get that is by all the commands, fulfilling all the commands. Isn't that accurate? Who can do that? Nobody. No one can do that. But that's the only way David could put that. That's the only thing he could say, because that's the only way to say it correctly. Now, process this. Jesus became flesh, and what does he do? He keeps all the commands. He reconstitutes humanity with God. He does what David says the purpose of the plan was. And as a result of that, if anyone is in Christ, they're a new creature. The old is gone, new has come. All this is from God. It's always been from God. When David said, if you want to reconnect with God, you have to obey all His commands. That's always the way it's been. God revealed Himself, said, here's how we can be equal. You do it, we reconnect. Couldn't get it done, but Jesus did. And because Jesus did that, God now reconciled us to Himself through Christ. Through Christ. And gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God has reconciled the world to Himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And He has committed us to the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we're ambassadors for Christ. And He says what we're doing is we're making an appeal. God's making His appeal through us and saying, you can't do this on your own. You can't fulfill all God's commandments and be reconstituted to God without the person of Jesus. And so we implore you on Christ's behalf to be reconciled to God. The only way it works is through the person of Jesus. Okay, back from the sidebar. Some ideas maybe to help us focus on that kind of purpose in our plans. We need to, I think, first of all, make our serving personal. Make our serving personal. Ephesians 4 said that God gave some to be apostles and some to be prophets and some to be evangelists and some to be pastors and teachers, and the reason for that is to prepare God's people for works of service. God's people are to be servant workers. That's personal. That's personal. And there are various places in the plan that everybody fits, but the purpose is always the same. The purpose for every apostle was to serve. The purpose for every prophet was to serve. The purpose for every evangelist was to serve. The purpose for every body member is to find their place of service, not their assigned pew, their place of service. How much planning are you putting into your spiritual purpose? How much planning are you putting into your own spiritual purpose? I mentioned this a few weeks back, and actually I think Bill and Colleen were on vacation when I mentioned it. Was in a conversation with Bill, and one of the sentences that he mentioned just really stuck with me, and that is, what are you doing for the life of this body? That's a great question, because it comes to the very purpose of every plan. What are we doing for the purpose of life, for the life of the body? Without adding something to the life, then it becomes pretty obvious that if we're not adding to the life, we're depleting the life. We're taking something from the life. And so when we reference church health, we talk about dead churches, you know what's happened? People have stopped contributing something to the life of the body and become content just drawing away from that. So we need to make our service personal. And secondly, we also need to make our service practical. Make our service practical. The best plans abide within the boundaries of practicality. Now, that should not cause us to stop dreaming of great things. But what it should do is bring us into the realm of reality. The scripture says, in Ephesians 4, says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that God is giving gifts to his people for a purpose, but that those gifts differ. And that the Spirit is giving those just as he wills. In other words, God's will is involved in the process of who we are, what we have, what's present. And it's just practical to understand that as we look to fulfilling our spiritual purposes. And this in no way diminishes the work, the ability, the capability of God, but it is that which gives us an honest spiritual understanding of where things are, and we recognize that, and we work within that. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we have all these different gifts, but the same Spirit. We have different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of workings, but the same God works in all. And all these are the work of the one and the same Spirit who gives them to each one just as he determines. So there's all this different stuff at work, and practically we need to understand that. I want to offer an illustration, and probably this is an illustration that most of you know a whole lot more than I do, because you native Nebraskans have given more study to this, and like I say, you just are going to know a whole lot more than what I read this last week. But I want to show you an illustration of something that illustrates how the personal commitment to service within the bounds of practicality became reality, but became an outstanding reality. This is about the North Platte Canteen.
O God of Israel, hear my prayer, hear my plea. Send your blessings from above down on me. Take the labor of my hands. I surrender to your plans. Make your will my deep desire. Fill my heart with holy fire. I want to do more for you. O God of glory, God of grace, look down on me as I sing, as I sing. I know your love for me does not depend on what I do, but I want to do more. I want to do more. I want to do more for you. Knowing you are always near takes away all doubt and fear. I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I want to do more for you. O God of glory, God of grace, look down on me as I sing, as I sing. I know your love for me does not depend on what I do, but I want to do more. I want to do more. I want to do more.
things I read, they talked about people being together all night long cooking chickens because the sandwiches were either chicken salad or egg salad. And they cooked chickens all night long. And then they did an assembly line to literally make thousands of sandwiches waiting for the soldiers to stop. Up to 20 trains a day. There was one gal, she was famous for angel food cakes. And the problem with angel food cakes is it takes a lot of eggs. And her chickens couldn't keep up. So she found a friend that raised turkeys. And she started using turkey eggs, which were larger, and she only needed half a dozen turkey eggs to make her angel food cake instead of a dozen. But just story after story of what these people sacrificed. I think, 150 different communities volunteering to take care of that. And to do that, not just, once a week, but to do it every day for 6 years? That's tremendous. A tremendous plan. But the plan was only the framework upon which personal service could be administered. It just gave the opportunity. Planning should encourage the exercise of personal commitment and responsibility. Colleen mentioned in class the workshop yesterday at York, and the essence of the workshop, how to reach folks, bring people back, bring people to Christ. And it was really interesting because my mind had been preparing for this and then hearing all that went on there. But sometimes the plan that is bred within the body, rather than motivating personal service, sometimes we've let a plan diminish our personal service. And what has easily happened is, David had a passion for planning, but there was always a purpose behind the plan, whether it was to cover up his sin or whether it was to bring glory to God. And more often than not, that's what the purpose was, to bring folks into a greater connection with God. So David was driven by the passion of the plan so that the plan could fulfill its purpose. And what sometimes happens to us is we become obsessed with the plan. And the more the plan becomes the emphasis, the easier it is to bury our sense of personal responsibility. Let me just throw out some examples. Let's just say that we develop a plan that on Tuesday nights we're going to meet at the building and we're going to walk the area around the building and knock doors and try to set up Bible studies with people. And that's what we're going to do. So what happens when that plan becomes announced? Well, there's a whole slug of folks that immediately say, that cold turkey door knocking thing just isn't my bag. Okay, so all that gets dismissed. But then what happens to the person that works on Tuesday night? And before long, the plan, rather than encouraging personal service, the plan has become our excuse for not doing our own personal evangelism. And the plan was initiated to help us do personal evangelism. So you see, we can become so corrupt in the idea of the plan. The plan can actually diminish what it was intended to encourage. We have a Bible class plan. We have classes divided into this group, and we need teachers for those things. And, the thing works. The plan, sometimes people say, well, it's working. I'm not doing any part of it. Don't feel much compulsion to be a part of it. So, again, a plan gets in place. A plan works. We have a plan to take food to members that are sick or hurting. And we developed this plan. We organized this plan. And you remember we used to have the different groups, Southwest, Northwest. If you were in the Southwest area of town and there was somebody in need and you were in that group, what did you do? You took them food. What if you were in the Northwest side? That's not the plan, Dan. That's not the plan. Where in the book do we find that the plan makes the purpose subservient? You see, there's nothing wrong with having a passion for a plan. David did that. He did it very well. However, his planning was so to encourage the purpose to be delivered. I love David, the organizer, the planner. His planning was intense and passionate. However, it was also purposeful. David didn't plan so as to dismiss responsibility. His planning sought to obligate individuals to fulfill their roles of submissive service. And that's where he was at. While planning is necessary and good, it's helpful. It only should provide the mechanism to encourage a reliable and personal spiritual expansion. Plans don't need to grow, people do. Every plan should propagate a purpose. So the challenge for this morning. You see, we've become such plan-oriented spiritual servants that we can actually feel justified in dismissing ourselves from participation in any number of plans for any number of reasons and feel totally at ease with that. I want us to challenge ourselves. First thing David did when he got everybody together was, I charge you. I want to challenge us, folks. Plans only bring us to fulfill a purpose. So if we wait around and say, somebody needs to plan this, somebody needs to organize this, somebody, and you know the thing about somebody said somebody and nobody and anybody and everybody, you've heard that song. But if that's where we get locked, how much are we growing in our own personal service? So I want to challenge us, folks. We don't even need a plan to fulfill our purpose. It'll help. But there doesn't need to be a plan. You want to see more done with our young people? Do more with our young people. You want to see more done with our college age, young adults, young marrieds? Do more with the young adults, college people, young marrieds. We don't have to have a plan, because all the plan will do is probably release us from our sense of responsibility. If you sense the responsibility, do. And then maybe throw a plan in. Use a plan to get things a little more organized, structured. Give a framework to it. But don't sit around and wait for a plan. Wait for somebody else to plan. David planned for a purpose. Let's be people of purpose. Develop the plan around the purpose to fulfill the purpose.